Okay, we're going to look at Between a Rock and a Hard Place, which is one of the passages in your IGCSE English Language anthology. So make sure you've got a copy of it in front of you, and we're just going to go through a few things that you could look at if you're writing about this in the exam. First thing is the word consumes in line 32. We're going to look at a couple of examples of imagery which are interesting, and I think this is a really interesting word because the writer here is using personification when he describes the way the chockstone consumes the sky. And it seems to me to suggest that the stone it's monstrous and it kind of has the capacity to destroy. Think of the word consumes means it's like the stone is kind of eating the sky, isn't it? It could also emphasize maybe the sheer size of the stone, and it maybe enables us to see from his perspective the sudden way in which it takes over his whole field of vision. It's kind of like the sky up above him is being eaten by this stone. That's how monstrous it is. Look at the phrase refrigerator chockstone. You could call this a metaphor here because in the noun phrase refrigerator chockstone, he's using it to describe maybe the size, the shape, and the weight of the stone in a way that's relatable to a non-specialist reader. So the use of a domestic image here in such a barren and potentially hostile environment perhaps adds to the sense of danger that he could be in. And maybe it hints as well at the impossibility of rescue in a place so far from civilization. You know, here he is out in the middle of nowhere. So to use this metaphor, comparing this stone to a refrigerator, to link to something from the domestic, from the familiar, is a reminder that he is not in a safe domestic environment at all. He's in this barren wilderness, and he could be stranded there for, well, forever. Okay, you could also look at specific lexical choices that the writer uses, and look at, well, why does he use those? He uses a fair bit of specialist lexis, words like stemming, for instance, when he's describing his maneuvers up and down the rocks. And one of the reasons he uses those is because he's trying to describe it in a very detailed, precise way, and these are the lexical terms that enable him to do this. But he's also aware maybe that a non-specialist reader might not be familiar with such lexis, so he also then glosses it and uses an analogy to explain. So he talks about chimneying, doesn't he? And he explains what he means by stemming, so that even if you're not familiar with that terminology, you'll be able to understand what he's talking about. Another example of a specific lexical choice. Remember, lexis just means words, so a lexical choice just means word choice. Another example of a lexical choice could be the use of the word claustrophobic that he uses in the first paragraph. It kind of has connotations of danger and fear, doesn't it? You know, this idea of being trapped. And therefore, it's one example of a word that he perhaps uses to foreshadow the accident. You know, this is before anything's actually happened, isn't it? And therefore, it helps to build up the tension before the incident actually occurs. You could also look for sentence types. At one point, he says, "Good God, my hand." And here you could talk about him using an exclamative. Remember, there are 4 sentence types that you can talk about. A declarative is a statement. A directive is a command. An exclamative is an exclamation of some sort, and an interrogative is a question. Here he uses, with a "good God, my hand," he uses an exclamative. I suppose just to show that the sheer strength of emotion at this point. He's in such pain and in such panic, isn't he? That he can barely speak. You know, he can't use a fuller sentence construction because he's in such pain. He's in, you know, there's such fear. Later on, he then says, "Come on, move." I mean, he's kind of like sort of talking to the rock or to his hand at that point. But there he's using a directive. The verb, the "come on" and the "move," they're both imperatives, aren't they? But the sentence type is a directive. And he uses it at the end of the passage in the only moment of direct speech when he's kind of grunting, you know, in desperation and urgency, isn't he, to try and get it to move. You could also look at the sentence construction. Look at the bit that begins in slow motion. It's a really, really long sentence, isn't it? And there are lots of clauses here separated by semicolons. And they perhaps help to emphasize the idea that from his perspective, it's like as if time has slowed down in his moment of panic as his hand is being crushed. And so the length of the sentence at this point emphasizes this idea of time slowing down. Another example of a sentence type that you could look at is there's this really short sentence, just a two-word sentence on lines 40, 41, where it says, then silence. Now, this shouldn't really be a sentence because it hasn't got a verb in it, so you could call it a minor sentence or a non-sentence. And it's just after that really long one, isn't it? So you could say that it's in stark contrast to that previous 5-line sentence. And the abrupt brevity at this point helps to emphasize the disbelief he feels at the realization of what's occurred. So the shortness of the sentence highlights his shock to the point of speechlessness. He can barely speak. Finally, you could look at the linguistic devices or techniques or features that the writer uses. Have a look, for instance, at lines 38 to 39, and you'll see that he uses several words from the semantic field of the body on these lines. He uses words like a hand, arm, wrist, palm, thumb, fingers. And I think the reason why he's constantly mentioning all these body parts here is that he's emphasizing how he's entirely, completely focused on the impact of the accident on his body. As he narrates the incident from his perspective, he speaks only of each body part as his eye darts from one part to another, assessing the damage. So he's looking at his hand, his arm, his wrist, his palm, his thumb, his fingers. So we focus on each part with him because that's what he's focusing on, and we're looking at the whole thing from his perspective at that moment. Another thing that you could say in terms of language is you could look at the use of emotive pre-modification. So for instance, when he talks about flaring agony or desperate brain, pre-modification just means putting an adjective before a noun. So emotive pre-modification just means putting an emotive adjective before a noun. So look at those noun phrases, flaring agony, desperate brain, and it just highlights the intensity of his emotions at key points during the description. So have another read through the passage, make sure you've highlighted those examples, see if you can find some more as well, and then just be ready to pick those examples out, making sure that you're able to talk about language and structure when you're writing about the passage in the exam.